Thank you. This is the story of an ordinary man who found himself in the most extraordinary of times. It's also the story of what many Canadians did in the 11 Spitfire squadrons that the Royal Canadian Air Force overseas fielded. Nearly 1,000 Canadians died on fighter operations, but after the Battle of Britain, the story of the fighter boys is rarely told. And at the time of his death, Lloyd Chadburn was one of the most famous fighter leaders in the RCAF, and his decorations were not solely for personal victory and for his battlefield exploits, but for his exceptional leadership of his men in battle.
Forged by the Allied armies in World War II, none have played a more vital part than the fighter planes. And of these, the Spitfire has by far the longest and most eventful history. The Spitfire, so dainty in appearance, so deadly in action. RCAF airmen flying in Spitfire wings have written a proud page for Canada in the winning of this greatest war. They have chalked up fine records in many theaters of operation. Men with flying in their blood like Buzz Burling of Malta, Dal Russell and Keith Hodson in Britain and Normandy, Wendell Buck McNair, one of many Canadian aces, and the late Lloyd Chadburn, who once said of his men, "They do the good jobs and I get the decorations."
A movie called Wasp Wings, and it was produced in 1945 by the Royal Canadian Air Force Overseas Film Unit. And at the end of it, or not at the end of it, at the end of the first minute of it, where they're talking about what the Spitfires did in 1940 to 45, they talk about Lloyd Chadburn. And I think that it's absolutely fascinating that a year after his death in 1944, they still talked about Lloyd Chadburn and talked about what a great leader he was. He concluded the war as the Royal Canadian Air Force's highest decorated fighter pilot, a title that would later be surpassed by George Kiefer. But if he was an American, there'd be 5 movies and probably a TV series about him already. Not my words, but those are words that I hear all the time. Every person I've ever met who knew him personally had nothing but the most glowing things to say about him. And his tragic death after D-Day cut his incredible story short. So who was Lloyd Chadburn? Why was he one of the most admired RCAF leaders of the war? And why did the Americans nickname him the Angel? Let's jump into the middle of his story. The Canadian-led raid on Dieppe in France was going to be just a short incursion, and it would be protected by the largest air armada yet put together, 54 fighter squadrons, including 6 RCAF squadrons. The raid, of course, was a complete disaster for the ground forces with enormous casualties, but the air forces would report some good success. Claims for nearly 100 enemy aircraft destroyed were made by the Allied air forces. Actually, that was double what the real number was, but that's okay. But we lost just over 60 pilots, and the 6 RCAF squadrons claimed 14 destroyed or probably destroyed for the loss of 14 aircrew. One of the newest operational Canadian Spitfire squadrons, number 416, has spent most of the year in Scotland flying convoy for cover for convoys, and had moved south just in time to participate in this raid. Dieppe would be the first time the squadron operated as a full-size unit of 12 aircraft in the air under the command of 22-year-old squadron leader Lloyd Chadburn. There would be 4 patrols over the assault, starting at 0650. And when 416 Squadron on the 3rd shift arrived over the smoky town at 5,000 feet, they could see enemy aircraft in the distance, but none came close to their operational area. A 2nd patrol at 1050 put the pilots over the beachhead just as the troops were beginning to withdraw. and flying 7,000 feet above Chadburn's 616 Squadron was providing top cover. And they engaged and damaged 4 Focke-Wulf 190s, but the enemy aircraft that broke through the top cover turned away before Chadburn and 416 Squadron could engage them. As would occur with each patrol, push the button, ding. As would occur with each patrol, Chadburn's squadron returned to RAF Hawkins information. Takeoffs, also executed information, were likened to a cavalry charge by one enthusiastic pilot. On the third patrol, most of the troops had been evacuated and were pulling away from France. While flying towards a reported battle area, more than a dozen Luftwaffe FW-190s appeared just above and behind 416 Squadron, in a perfect position to bounce or attack the squadron, and performing what was later described as the best tight turn information we have ever executed. Chadburn led the 12 Spitfires to turn the tables on the attacking Focke-Wulf 190s. The Germans were surprised and quickly overwhelmed, with Chadburn's pilots scoring 3 destroyed and 1 damaged. The enemy fighters scattered, and 616 Squadron, flying top cover, was able to damage 1 more as it tried to escape. Chadburn pulled the squadron together to resume their mission, and they spied a formation of 7 Junkers Ju-88 bombers ready to drop bombs on a retreating convoy. Chadburn again led the squadron into the attack, forced the bombers to jettison their bomb load and flee, with all the bombers being reported as damaged and maybe one probably destroyed. It was a textbook demonstration of the fighter leader's mission, to bring the maximum number of guns to bear on the enemy. Chadburn himself claimed a probable and a damaged aircraft, with victories shared amongst 8 of the 12 pilots. And in their first operation as a whole unit, 416 Squadron was the top scoring RCAF squadron overall that day and had suffered no casualties. And he was the only RCAF squadron commander chosen to speak on a radio broadcast the next day about Dieppe, heard all across Canada. Dieppe was his 23rd birthday. 5 RCAF fighter pilots were awarded a Distinguished Flying Cross for their actions during the Dieppe raid, and Chadburn's was explicitly awarded for his leadership of 416. I'll now note the citation, which includes these words: "This achievement reflects the greatest credit on this officer's excellent leadership, and he has inspired confidence in those under his command." And one of the things that really stands out for me is that through bad luck and just bad timing on Chadburn's part, this was only his 2nd engagement with enemy aircraft. So how did a guy who arguably was quite new, even though he'd been in the Air Force for 2 years at this time and overseas for 18 months, how did he make such a success of himself, and more importantly, of his squadron, on their very first try at combat? To understand his story, I think we need to go back before the war. Lloyd really wanted to join the Air Force, but the RCAF at the time was very small. He didn't come with the technical skills, and any officer needed a university degree, so they turned him down. Lloyd worked in a bank and had none of the other qualifications, like a pilot's license, that might have endeared him to the Royal Air Force, and many Canadians had followed that route. But when the war broke out, he applied again, and he quit his job at the bank, certain to be snapped up now. The RCAF turned him down again. "We're not ready, pal. Come back later." They really weren't ready for the massive influx of applicants, and they had to get their own house in order. And the RCAF had come a long way by late 1939, but boy, it had a long way to go. It took until the middle of April 1940 before the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan was ready for warm bodies. And Lloyd Chadburn was finally sworn in. He was 20 years old. Chadburn started his basic training at the Manning Depot in Toronto, and that lasted 2 weeks, 2 weeks of basic training. And then he was sent on to the newly opened No. 1 Initial Training School as part of the first class, where they would decide if he would be a pilot, or, as he feared, after an interview with a psychologist, he would become an air gunner. The RCF didn't have any training facilities for pilots open yet. There's the boy there looking very serious. One of the very few pictures of him not smiling. The RCF didn't have any basic training facilities for pilots open yet, and the Great British Commonwealth Air Training Plan was still under construction. In groups of 5 to 7 students, the would-be pilots were sent to flying schools across the country. In Chadburn's case, he was sent to the Border Cities Flying School in Windsor, Ontario, to fly Tiger Moths. And flying didn't come easy to him. He failed his navigation test, which just added some more fuel to that air gunner nightmare. Lloyd dealt with a failed engine and landed in a farmer's field, with this Tiger Moth going nose down after it had completed the landing. No damage to pilot or aircraft. After successfully rewriting his navigation exam and passing his various flying tests, young Chadburn finished 9th in his wider class of 29, noted as a consistent and quick thinker, willing to do the extra work to master the subjects, although only an average pilot. Lloyd was thrilled to be sent to Uplands in Ottawa for further training at the newly established No. 2 Service Flying Training School. Lloyd particularly enjoyed flying the Harvard, a powerful aircraft, and he's pictured here flying the Harvard on his first solo formation flight. After completing intermediate squadron training, Chadburn was awarded his pilot wings in October 1940, much to his surprise and delight. Now he was on to learn to the Advanced Training Squadron to learn some of the more military subjects. The big danger now, though, is that he's going to get plowed back into the system, into the BCATP system, as an instructor. And he was, again, rated as an average pilot, but even though he finished 4th in his class, one does have to wonder, how good were the pilots that were not average? Along with 9 other classmates, he was going to be sent overseas to join the RCAF in England. And even more surprising to him, pilot officer Lloyd Chadburn was going to do it as an officer in the King's service. Prior to heading across the ocean, Lloyd proposed to his best girl, Eleanor Langford. They had been dating for a couple of years at this point, and she accepted his proposal, but a few days later returned the ring in the mail. She didn't really understand this whole going in the Air Force thing, and was actually quite opposed to it. Lloyd was understandably heartbroken, but applied himself to his job as an RCAF pilot. Upon arrival to London, Chadburn and his fellow pilots were all posted to RAF Digby in Lincolnshire, formerly known as to the freshly reorganized No. 2 RCAF Squadron. Formerly known as 112 Squadron, flying Lysanders like this, the squadron was changed to No. 2 Fighter Squadron and was going to be re-equipped with Hurricanes. And more than half the squadron personnel was left behind, as it was soon going to be populated by some veterans of the Battle of Britain. Top Canadian ace Gordie McGregor was going to be the squadron commander, and at 39 years of age, Gordie McGregor was the oldest fighter pilot in the Battle of Britain. His 2 flight leaders would also be veterans. Ed Reno, Vaughn Corbett, and Tommy Little would join the ranks as an additional instructor. McGregor knew that his pilots were going to have to get up to speed and quickly. Chadburn's cohort was joined a week later by another 10 pilots fresh from Canada. These 20 fresh new pilots, unlike everyone that would follow, would receive no training in an operational training unit. Everything that they would learn would be in this squadron. McGregor trained them as hard as he could in the miserable winter conditions of 1941. Here we see Chad, as he was now known in the Air Force, about to embark on an early January flight in a hurricane. After a total of 36 hours flying in a hurricane, Chadburn was declared ready for operations. And shortly after that, the squadron, now numbered as 402 RCAF Squadron, was declared operational. Scrambles to intercept aircraft, almost always friendly, and protective patrols were over convoys were on the East Coast. That's what their missions were in the spring of 1941. Chadburn's flights were not without excitement, though. He had another engine failure. And Chad's picture-perfect landing in a farmer's field saved the airplane, but more importantly, saved the pilot. On another occasion, he was doing some solo flying when he got lost in the fog. He landed in a farmer's field, found his location, and headed off to the correct aerodrome. 402 Squadron's pilots were now ready for anything, or so they believed. 8 of these 27 pilots would not survive the war, and 3 others would be taken prisoner. Chadburn soon established himself as a steady leader and was quickly made a section commander on patrols and scrambles. And I was always amused by this picture. Everybody's got their best kit on. And there's Chadburn. He's got his tie askew, his top buttons undone, his hands are in his pockets, and he's got an ever-present goofy grin. Kind of hallmarks for Chadburn as he gets older. After more than 50 operational flights with 402 Squadron, mostly convoys and patrols, Chad was posted to the newly formed 412 Squadron. And the video's not going to run. That's okay. Where he finally flew the Spitfire, and now is one of the pilots teaching the others the fine points of operational flying. And here, believe it or not, in the middle of all this, there is some rare color footage of Lloyd Chadburn mugging for the camera. And shortly after helping to get 412 Squadron operational, he received a new posting and a promotion as well. He was sent to serve as a flight commander with 19 Squadron Royal Air Force, which was flying from Coltishall near the English Channel. Again, the unit was rebuilding after losing 9 pilots in the preceding month, including the squadron commander and both flight leaders. Chadburn would again be training the new pilots, but he was still thrilled with the pace of operations and the cosmopolitan nature of his flight, which included Canadians, British, Australians, Rhodesians, and even some Czech pilots. As the rainy autumn of 1941 set in, the weather turned sour, creating ideal conditions for operational flights that they codenamed Rhubarb. These missions involved 2 or 3 fighters flying at wave-top height across the channel, just below the cloud base, looking for targets of opportunity. The higher-ups felt that this is what they could do to keep the Germans off balance, lean into France, and feel good about being on the offensive and helping the Russians now in the war. And it was sold to the pilots as an opportunity for action, with low risk of being shot down by enemy aircraft due to the low cloud, and also safe from anti-aircraft fire due to the surprise nature of the attack. None of these things were true. And in fact, squadron leaders and wing commanders came to hate them for the losses that they incurred. Chadburn seized this opportunity for a little action and set off to attack an airfield in Holland. Navigation was slightly off, and despite that, they ended up over a well-defended Kriegsmarine harbor. And despite this, they managed to shoot up a destroyer without sustaining any damage to themselves. Chadburn also famously shot up a trio of enemy torpedo boats, as we see in this action. He received a congratulatory letter from the Admiralty for his efforts. Now, despite his peers at every squadron having an opportunity to engage in German aircraft, Chadburn kept missing out due to being on the wrong mission. He's on leave. He was just not being on call. But finally, in January of 1942, Chadburn and his commanding officer had a chance to engage a retreating Junkers Ju-88 bomber. They knocked some pieces off it, and Chadburn excitedly fired off all of his ammunition, and he managed to earn a shared credit for a damaged aircraft. Shortly after, he got the transfer he had put in for, and he was sent to the far north of Scotland. Chadburn was kind of unhappy about being taken from an operational RAF squadron and stuck as far away from the action as possible. He wanted to go to Malta or the Far East, and he was sure that's where his transfer request would take him. A snowy Peterhead in the far north of Scotland was definitely not his choice. Well, that's the next picture. 416, here you can see the Spitfire in the snow. 416 Squadron had been formed in November of 1941 in Peterhead, and it comprised 29 fresh RCAF pilots led by a trio of RAF veterans. It was declared operational on the 1st of February 1942, just a month before Chadburn arrived. But change was in the wind, and there was an effort to have Canadian squadrons commanded and staffed by Canadians. And so, at 22 years of age, Lloyd Chadburn became the first graduate of the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan to command a squadron, and the youngest squadron leader in the RCAF and RAF as well. Chadburn took stock of the squadron and saw that they needed that familiar Chadburn touch. Training, training, and then more training. In fact, in the month of March, under Chadburn's leadership, the squadron more than doubled the amount of training hours and led all operational squadrons in that statistic. On the home front, Chad continued to stew about Eleanor's rejection, but a chance encounter with a lovely young waif named Vera Bloomfield, lovely indeed, that kicked him out of those doldrums. And they met, and they were both on leave, and they had an instant connection. She was a section officer at the maintenance depot near Carlisle, and he often took his Spitfire all the way across Scotland to visit her. You know, the Spitfire needs to be maintained. So do the pilots. Indeed. After the excitement of Dieppe, 416 Squadron was ordered over to join the Kenley Wing, which also had 3 other RCAF squadrons in it. And 416 would be based at nearby Red Hill, 7 miles away. That's still a 40-minute drive with the roads as they were then and still now. The pace of operational missions was steady at Kenley, with convoy patrols and air-sea rescue missions occupying most of their time, but Chadburn started to have opportunities to lead the entire wing on bomber escort missions, particularly the new US B-17 groups, but also some daylight Lancaster and B-24 Liberator missions. It was also during this time that 416 Squadron adopted this nose art to be painted on its aircraft, a leaping lynx and a maple leaf. Nose art on fighter aircraft, although you certainly saw some, it was somewhat uncommon. And at Chadburn's instigation, the squadron was also adopted by the city of Oshawa, his old hometown, and would become known as the City of Oshawa Squadron. And this was painted on all of their planes as well. This was actually the first of many RCAF squadrons that would become adopted by towns and cities across the country. Much had been done traditionally for regiments and for ships of the Navy. After a successful day in operations, the boys of 416 went to the officers' mess at Red Hill, a lovely, rambling old residence, for a party, or a thrash, as Chad would call it. When they arrived, there was an older group of RAF officers with their wives on the side of the mess, and after introductions, the 2 groups separated to each side of the mess. But Chad felt that their celebration was lacking something. So he sent a trio of pilots, led by his wingman, Jackie Ray, back to town to bring back some women or maybe some wafts from nearby Nutfield Priory. So Ray left and broke up a Saturday night dance with stockings and chocolates, and returned with a truck full of women. And the Canadians had a very lively party, much to the dismay of the stuffier RAF types who left in a huff. But the next day, the group commander, the base commander, brought the squadron leader and the pilots into the office to answer for their embarrassing behaviors in the mess the night before. And Chadburn intervened with mock disgust. "You can be sure, sir, that I will deal with these pilots in the most severe of ways." The group captain eyed Chadburn and let him. "Okay, that's fine, thank you very much, squadron leader." As they left, Ray pointed out to Chad, "This was all your idea." Chadburn simply ignored him. As the new year of 1943 began, Chadburn's tour of operations ended, granting him a month's leave. In the 24 months of his first tour, he had 320 hours of operational flying time, well in excess of the 200 hours that was supposed to be a tour. With a degree of sadness, he left behind his friends at 416 Squadron and went home to Canada for his leave. Here we see him with his mother. But his leave was completely consumed with duty. He called or met with the family of his men in 416 Squadron. He attended numerous civic receptions, presentations. He also took time to meet with other Air Force trainees and the Air Cadet Squadron that had asked to use his name. Hardly an agenda for a guy on a holiday. The month of leave passed quickly, and Lloyd Chadburn was eager to get back to England and his comrades. And his last 2 Atlantic crossings were aboard high-speed luxury liners. This time, SS Manchester Trader, a much slower and smokier freighter. The journey was perilous. To avoid a massive U-boat battle in the mid-Atlantic, the convoy diverted north, leading them into an ice field, and 9 ships were damaged by icebergs, and 1 was actually sunk. Upon his return, Chad visited his friends in 416 Squadron and brought news from home before being sent to Digby for a month of retraining. Once ready, he rejoined the Kenley Wing as a supernumerary with 403 Squadron while he waited for any squadron to have an opening for a leader. And Chadburn was now under the command of Ace Wing Commander Johnny Johnson of the RAF. And Johnson, a very aggressive leader, led his 2 Canadians to high scores and would finish the war as one of the top aces of the RAF. It didn't take too long before a squadron posting became available, and Chadburn was sent back to Digby to command 402 Squadron, while he had hoped to command 416 City of Oshawa Squadron again. But he did find some satisfaction in returning to the squadron that he started with some 18 months earlier. He was flying under Wing Commander Sid Ford, a well-regarded Canadian ace, and escort missions for anti-shipping strikes with bullfighters became the norm. Ford was the first BCATP graduate to become a wing commander, but was only in that role for a month and a half. He was shot down in one of these attacks, and here you can see the fury and the chaos of a bullfighter convoy attack. Chadburn was promoted to replace him. But to Chadburn's delight, 416 Squadron had just relocated to Digby and would now be part of his wing, reuniting him with his 2 old squadrons, 402 and 416 City of Oshawa Squadron. He was the wing commander, or wing co, or wing leader. The man who operationally led the unit into action. The administrative tasks were left to others to perform. The wing leaders marked their aircraft with their own initials, starting with Douglas Bader in 1941, much to the dismay of intelligence officers everywhere. Here we see Chad in his new iron, as he calls it, LVC, marked with his initials. Now, RAF Digby in Lincolnshire is kind of in the middle of the country, and it's a backwater where squadrons typically rested, recuperated, and retrained. And I've been there, and it's in the middle of nowhere, absolutely. But Chadburn wasn't content with this situation, and he charmed his way into frontline operations for his wing. Soon, Chadburn and his Digby traveling circus were flying to forward bases all along the English Channel to provide escort missions for the growing Allied bomber and strafing missions into France and Holland. Chadburn's dedication to training and improving both squadrons in his wing meant that every day during the summer of 1943 was filled with some form of training. Even on operational days, as they flew to their advanced bases or returned home, wing formations, cloud flying exercises were always conducted. Chadburn's squadrons were flying the clipped wing Spitfire Mark V LF. The LF stands for Low Altitude Fighter. And this put the Digby wing at a disadvantage against enemy aircraft at a high altitude. So they were tasked with the dangerous close escort role for the bombers at a medium altitude. And that meant that Johnson's Kenley wing, who were equipped with the much more capable Spitfire Mark IX, took on the first line of defense with their tasking of high escort. Chadburn's close escort would only engage if the enemy broke through the top cover. And as Johnson said, he, quote, pitied the poor close escort that only gets the crumbs. And this was true. Through June and July of 1943, Johnson's wing scored 31 destroyed, while Chad's close escort accounted for only 8. The U.S. Army Air Force had initially deployed the Martin B-26 Marauder in Pacific and Mediterranean theaters as a low-altitude bomber, leading to some tragic outcomes. However, by the end of July of 1943, they figured out how to deploy them effectively. The bombers would attack targets at a medium altitude, 11,000 feet, with Spitfire close escort and P-47 Thunderbolts or Spitfire Mark 9s as a high escort. And Chadburn and his wing of Spitfire Mark 5s were well suited for the close escort role, and from the end of July to the year's end, this was their primary mission. Occasionally, Chadburn included the squadrons from Coltishall as part of his wing, but by September, Chadburn's escort was legendary. An Associated Press reporter interviewed American bomber crews who praised Chadburn's exceptional escort, dubbing him their guardian angel, as they felt his escort would provide safe passage home. Chadburn hated it, but the nickname certainly stuck in the press. As you can see from this cartoon panel, it says, "Chadburn's covering us like a protecting angel." It's from True Aviation Picture Stories, a comic book produced in 1944 in the United States, with a cover story about Lloyd Chadburn, the airman's angel. And while luck played a role, particularly regarding the avoiding of anti-aircraft fire, Chadburn's reputation held true. The legend, at the time, claimed that in over 60 escort missions flown by Chadburn and his Digby wing, only one bomber was lost to an enemy fighter, and that pilot paid for it with his life. However, with most legends, there's an element of truth, but it's a bit mixed up. Yes, one fighter did break through to shoot at and hit a bomber, and Jeff Northcott in front of 402 Squadron was hot on its tail, but it escaped that day and was not shot down. That bomber, Payoff it's called, was already going down due to flak damage, and the co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Andrew Lindsay, was unable to open his escape hatch and was about to bail out through the open bomb bay doors of the flaming aircraft when an FW-190 sprayed the bomb bay in front of him with cannon fire. 402 Squadron Jeffrey Northcott was closing on it fast, with his guns ablazing, and the two fighters scattered in different directions just before they would have collided. And as soon as the shooting stopped, Lindsay dived through the flames and through the open bomb bay doors, and now 4 of the 6 crew members of Payoff survived, with 2, including Lindsay, making it back to England before the war's end to tell their story. So the actual fact of the matter is that Chadburn's escort never lost a bomber to enemy fighters, but he would never learn this. Oh, and the actual number of missions was not 60, but was over 100 bomber escort missions. Chadburn was awarded the Distinguished Service Order, second to the Victoria Cross, in the summer of 1943, and it was due to his exceptional leadership of the Digby wing. And at the point of this being awarded, his wing was still on the rise in fighter command and had not yet peaked. Chad was the first RCAF Fighter Leader to receive the DSO, and the citation says it all. Displayed exceptional leadership and great skill, while his fine fighting spirit has set a most inspiring example. Vera, Chad's girlfriend of nearly 2 years, wanted to be married to Lloyd, but he had become firm in his opinion about that topic. Marriage should not happen to a fighter pilot who cannot divide his attentions between Mary at home and a screaming Spitfire. He was often quoted in the paper saying that, and sadly, they went their separate ways. As the summer progressed, Chadburn's personal score and that of his Digby wing continued to climb, and this was partly due to a change in the Luftwaffe's tactics, as they focused on defending the fatherland from the daylight B-17 raids. The Luftwaffe began engaging lower, where the close escort operated rather than the high escort. And by November, the Digby wing was the highest scoring wing in fighter command, despite flying the older Spitfire model. The apex of Chadburn's time was a mission on November 3, 1943, escorting Marauders, 72 of them, to bomb the airfield at Amsterdam Schiphol. At the rendezvous point, it became clear that instead of 2 boxes of 36 bombers, 1 box was split into 2 and separated by some miles. Chadburn reorganized his escort to provide the best cover possible, and as they approached the airfield, flak opened up just after the bombs were released and took the wing off one of the bombers. This combat photograph of that day shows Bugs Bunny moments after it was hit. And you can see at the top corner the rest of the wing as it also goes down. Chadburn kept the well-trained escort steady through the heavy flak. There's not going to be a video on this. Chadburn kept the well-trained escort steady through the heavy flak, and then they were heading back to England. As they crossed the sea, about 15 German fighters descended behind a box of bombers, ready for the kill. Except that they were directly ahead of Chadburn and 402 Squadron. The enemy likely didn't see the bomber and the escorts that were still in the haze of Holland. Chadburn quickly engaged the unaware Messerschmitt 109s, and in a frantic and wild dogfight, numerous enemy aircraft were going down in smoke to both 402 and 416 squadrons, while the Marauders safely and swiftly went home. Flight Commander Art Sager and his wingmen chased fleeing Messerschmitts right down to the ground to ensure the kill. When the wing arrived back at their staging base of Colterschall and a tally was taken, there were claims for 9 aircraft destroyed during the 9-minute air battle, a hallmark day for the wing. Post-war record comparison reduced that number from 9 to 7 confirmed destroyed aircraft. And quick to take advantage of the public relations windfall, a radio broadcast was set up by the CBC. Chadburn would interview his pilots about their amazing mission, and it would be later broadcast across Canada. The wing commander briefed his boys that they needed to tell the story that they would have done better if they even had better equipment. And everyone should say that they should get this upgraded to the Spitfire Mark IX. Everyone enjoyed their moment in the front of the microphone, but as soon as RCAF headquarters heard the broadcast, they scuttled the whole thing, and the broadcast has never seen the light of day. His tour as Digby Wing Commander was marked by great success in the air with a high rate of victory over the enemy, but more important to Chad was also a high rate of success in keeping his pilots and those he escorted safe. In his 6-month tour as Wing Commander, he lost 5 pilots in operations, all at low altitude. 3 hit by debris, 1 by flak, and 1 just disappeared into a cloud. After he left the Digby Wing at the end of December, Wing Commander Chadburn received a 2nd Distinguished Service Order, the first Canadian so recognized, and one of only 4 who did. Chadburn famously commented on how his men put on a good show, yet he received the awards. The citation notes his outstanding leadership and great tactical skill, and that much of the success achieved can be attributed to this officer's sterling qualities. Another chance encounter during a fog-extended layover at Hawkinge, Chad met Nancy McKay, another WAF who worked in the plotting room there, and they hit it off. And when Chad's 2nd tour was up in December, he took 2 weeks of leave to go and hang out in Dover, near Hawkinge. Chad was assigned to group headquarters, but hated being a desk pilot as he felt he was a deadbeat. So he charmed his way onto a war bond tour in Canada, and in exchange he would be able to get back onto operations 2 months early. He took command of 127 Wing from Wing Commander Hugh Godefroy and was finally in a Spitfire Mark IX. The wing included 403 and 421 squadrons, along with 416 City of Oshawa Squadron, which pleased him very much. But the role of Wing Commander flying had evolved in the intervening 4 months since he last held a position, and the wings were now training to be dive bombers, with the wing co forbidden from engaging in actual combat, and instead leading the charge from 12,000 feet. The attacks targeted rail yards, fortifications, bridges, and priority targets known as no balls, which were in fact the launch sites for the nearly complete V-1 flying bomb. But it was clear that everything was building to a fever pitch, and the invasion of the continent was imminent. By the end of May 1944, despite minimal aerial opposition, Chadburn's Spitfires had accumulated an incredible 10 victories, placing them at the top of all Spitfire wings. Chad offered a bet of 30 pounds that from D-Day, whenever that would be, to D+30, the wing with the highest score would win 30 pounds and host a party for the losing side. 30 pounds is not an insignificant amount of money in those days. Johnny Johnson, commanding 144 wing, took the bet. George Kiefer, in charge of 126 wing, politely declined. June 6, 1944 marked the big day, and the Spitfires of the RCAF formed part of the vast air umbrella over the invading fleet. Chadburn's wing covered the American sector, patrolling Omaha Beach and Utah Beach, as seen here, while the other wings flew over the British and Canadian beaches. In fact, there were 38 fighter wings, each with at least 36 aircraft in the air, providing constant cover from before dawn to after dusk. And contrary to popular belief, the Germans actually did show up, and Allied air forces shot down over 40 enemy fighters and bombers trying to attack the soldiers storming the beachhead. However, the RCAF saw no action in the air at all. And the next few days were the same, with little action, but the invasion was really not going well for Chad's 127 wing. Between engine failures and the U.S. Navy shooting at them, they lost 4 pilots and 8 aircraft and were getting disheartened. The Navy gunners also shot down Chadburn's LVC and damaged it, and shot down his wingman, who ended up becoming a prisoner of war. Engineers landed on D-Day and immediately started creating the airfields to support the invasion. And when the advanced landing grounds were ready, Chadburn led his wing and landed in France. On D+5 and D+6, 403 and 421 squadrons were able to make use of these rustic airfields. By the 13th of June, it had now been a week since the invasion started, and there was good progress being made on the beachhead. And several of the advanced landing grounds were now in operation. Chadburn had been flying from France for a couple of days, and now 416 and 421 squadrons were going to spend the day flying from their dusty airfield in Basenville. Go ahead, Darius. There you go. Things were looking up, as the wing was now being tasked to patrol the eastern area over the Canadian and the British beaches. And more importantly, that's where the Luftwaffe was showing up. On the final patrol of the day, Chadburn received a report of potential enemy aircraft in the air, and so he flew off with 416 Squadron to investigate, leaving 421 to orbit over the beachhead. 421 Squadron was commanded by Wally Conrad, a friend of Chadburn's from before the war. When Chadburn reached the reported location, he found a squadron of American P-47s. So he turned back to rejoin the wing. And as they approached each other, Conrad spotted the oncoming Spitfires in a cloud and turned to avoid a collision. Chadburn, leading 416, narrowly missed Conrad but collided head-on with Frank Clark. Clark's aircraft exploded and Chadburn's disintegrated. Frank Clark was killed instantly. Chadburn fell to the ground from 12,000 feet, still strapped in his seat. He died shortly after landing and was buried near Benouville in France by the Royal Engineers, who retrieved him. There were now 8 deaths in 127 Wing, and they still hadn't seen the enemy. The war, of course, carried on. 403 Squadron Leader Bob Buckham was made Wing Commander to take over from Chad. He had flown with Chadburn since the beginning of 416 Squadron back in February of 1942. He picked up Chad's bet against Johnny Johnson. Buckham was only in that position for a month, though, before his tour was up. When Bob Buckham was told he was going home in August, he told his commander, "I will take a boat back across the channel. I am not flying over it one more time." He didn't expect he was going to survive the war after he had heard about Chadburn's death. And he stayed in the Air Force after the war, but was killed in a flying accident in 1947 in Whitehorse. So what happened to the bet? 127 Wing, led by Chadburn and then Buchan, took the lead with a banner day on June 15th, destroying 7 enemy aircraft. And they defended their lead until July 5th, when Johnny Johnson, leading 443 Squadron, shot down 8 aircraft on the last day, winning the bet 42-39. A large party was held afterwards, with the victors hosting a celebration in Lloyd Chadburn's honor. Wings Abroad was the official newspaper of the Royal Canadian Air Force overseas, and it was published every 2 weeks. And through its run from December of 1940 to June of 1945, it told the story of the RCAF overseas in Europe and in the Pacific theaters. It did so without giving away operational secrets, of course, and the publication of regular casualty lists was there, even if only in very, very small print. But throughout the entire 6-year run of the publication, it never ran an obituary for anyone who died in action until Lloyd Chadburn. Following the war, a newly formed French government awarded decorations to notable Allied servicemen. 12 Canadians received their highest honor, the Legion of Honor and the Croix de Guerre avec Palme, and only 4 of those 12 were actual operational pilots. Lloyd Chadburn among them. Lloyd Chadburn, the rest were all headquarters level officers, and the citation for Chadburn describes him as one of the most remarkable among the pilots of the Canadian Air Force, which is high praise indeed for an Air Force full of remarkable pilots. Lloyd Chadburn never sought the spotlight or personal victories, yet he managed to achieve a commendable score. He had 1 probable victory over Dieppe, and the rest of his victories as the Digby wing leader. He managed to accumulate 8 destroyed and 6 probables, 4 of which were all shared. Lloyd Chadburn demonstrated the highest standards of leadership through lessons taught and others that he acquired either through experience or osmosis. In the air, his tactical awareness was exceptional. He could visualize all the moving pieces in 3 dimensions and give concise orders to accomplish his mission, bring the maximum guns to bear on the enemy. Chadburn's entire first 2 years of operations before becoming a wing commander were spent helping other pilots get up to speed in the various squadrons he was in. Without a doubt, it was the single greatest element in his success at Dieppe, where he pulled surprise victory from the jaws of a certain disaster. Here's another panel from that comic book showing Chadburn training 416 Squadron in Scotland. It says, "I've never seen a better led squadron. Chadburn has a real talent for training men." In the chaotic environment of aerial combat, Chadburn's calm voice over the radio helped maintain composure and confidence among his pilots. Even though they could not talk directly to the bombers, the American pilots always cheered when Chadburn's LVC pulled up alongside the bomber leader. Chadburn often took new pilots under his wing to help them gain confidence. In one such operation, Danny Noonan was on his wing, and they were involved in a dogfight, chasing a German Messerschmitt. As he went into the clouds, Chad cheered him on. "Go get him, Danny," he said. And as he roared in to the cloud, he sees an airplane, he fires his guns at. It turned out to be his own wing leader that he was shooting at. He stopped immediately, but the whole flight home, wing leader was complaining that his engine was running a little bit rough. Noonan was sweating the whole flight home. When they got back to base, Noonan went up to him and apologized for putting a bullet into his engine. Chad laughed, slapped him on the back, and said, "Don't worry about it, Danny. Not the first time I've been shot at by our side." Notably, Chad became renowned for his aerial navigation skill, unparalleled. Despite his early struggles, he developed an uncanny ability to find his way home, even in the worst weather. And he often led his squadrons, and sometimes even the bombers, through the clouds, tightening formations as needed, and emerging directly over the airfield. His pilots suspected that he was getting help from the ground control, and they set several traps by listening in on different frequencies to catch him at it. But no such assistance was ever uncovered. Just as important as his leadership on the air was his leadership on the ground. The British innkeepers knew him as the laughing blonde Canadian. Here's a bit from that color film. He was very charismatic and engaging. Jackie Ray observed, Chad would say, "Let's go," and off we went, and it didn't matter where, as long as we were with him. He was genuinely self-effacing and even self-deprecating. He's not a line shooter and the least bit boastful. And every time a newspaper or radio story mentioned him, he would cringe, knowing that he was going to get some stick from the other pilots, and he was just there to do a job, not to gain any glory. One of his greatest leadership attributes was his genuine concern for all the men in his command, including the ground crew and administrative staff, and he took personal interest in their well-being and conversations. Note this picture of Wing Commander Jeff Northcott, who was one of Chad's squadron leaders. This was taken after February of 1945, at least 8 months after Lloyd Chadburn's death. Clearly visible on his desk is a picture of his girl back home and the charcoal sketch of Lloyd Chadburn. In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of Chadburn's death, a memorial event was held in Oshawa, and pilots and ground crew came from all across North America to remember and have a bit of a reunion. I had the good fortune of meeting Corporal Ted Gladman, who was a rigger at the Digby Wing. Despite being in ill health, he traveled 1,500 miles from Texas to pay his... He seemed to know every airman in the unit by his first name, Gladman told me, and he made a point of drawing each of us out in personal conversations. When we referred to him to our superiors, it was always respectfully the Wing Commander or Mr. Chadburn. But amongst ourselves, he was affectionately Chad, and he was one of us. Art Sager, who was flying under Johnny Johnson and ran into a bit of trouble low flying, was sent to Digby under Lloyd Chadburn as punishment. But he discovered it was a good move. Sager loved Chad dearly and continued to speak of him worshipfully right up until his death here in Victoria in 2007. Such was the impact that Chadburn had on him. In his diary, published in 2002 as Line Shoot, Sager wrote about his impressions of Wing Commander Chadburn after a few weeks at Digby. The adjective inspired was more than apt, as his leadership was effortless, stemming from character rather than conscious act. It was felt by all, and when the Wingco visited dispersals and hangars, faces lit up. When Chadburn returned to England in April 1944, he called up Nancy, but was told she had left to get married. Despondent, he called up Vera and spoke with her, and she had just gotten married the week before because she didn't even think he was ever coming back to England. Now he was completely torn up. What he didn't know was that the message about Nancy was wrong. It was a different Nancy that had left Hawkins to get married. His Nancy, on the other hand, was pregnant and gave birth to a son in September of 1944. No one knew anything about this son, Andrew. He appeared out of the blue in 1992. This photo was taken when he visited the Air Cadet Squadron with his father's name 50 years after his father visited. He was, without a doubt, the spitting image of his father. So, who was Lloyd Chadburn? Well, he was a leader. By force of his personality and his skill, he rose very quickly to a friend of his squadron leader, and he gets the final word on Lloyd Chadburn. When asked to describe Lloyd Chadburn, all Ray says is, all of his citations are for leadership. That's just another word until you meet Lloyd Chadburn. Thank you.